demanded that European countries double their military spending. The new German government has embraced the open remilitarization of Germany, a major shift in policy for Germany since the defeat of Hitler and Nazism in 1945. The German working class is going to pay a heavy price for this. Anyway, there's a lot there. Let's get started.
This deal comes out of World War II. And what do I mean by deal? The United States needed allies, a bumper between itself and the Soviet Union. They were really afraid, since the Soviets did more to win World War II than anybody else did, and they knew it.
To barge in here, do you know that I always thought, United States of America won the World War II until I met a historian who is also a retired veteran, and from from the perspective of that retired military man, I got to realize that Russia lost a lot of soldiers. Look, the man was saying that Russia even lost almost up to 4 million of their men in World War II. And the man also went on to say that Africa should be grateful to Russia because during the World War II, that was when most African nations, or I'll say, that was what drove the independence of most African nations, because the West were so busy and so engulfed in that war that they lost a lot of military might, so they couldn't control all their colonies. So in turn, Africa and some part of Asia took advantage of that and were able to get their independence out of it. So Africa and the world should really thank Russia for that. And Russia won the World War II, although they lost a lot of men, but they won the World War II, not United States.
And they were afraid of where that might go. Not that the Russians would invade, that was ridiculous, but that the communists inside Europe would have their day, knowing that they had an ally to the east. I want to remind people, the first post-World War II government of Charles de Gaulle in France had half a dozen members of the Communist Party of France in the cabinet as ministers. The second most important political party for 20 years after World War II in Italy was the Italian Communist Party, and so it went. This all had to be handled. And how was it going to be handled? You couldn't repress, because they had just come out of World War II with the worst repression imposed by the Nazis, the Germans who occupied. And who had been the hero of fighting against the repression? The Communist and Socialist Party people, who were in a position to make an even better struggle against anyone who tried to do that, again, domestic or foreign. So the United States had a problem. How do you squash socialism and capitalism? Here was the deal. We, the United States, would take care of everything military. We had the dominant military position. We had the atomic bomb before anybody else. We showed we were willing to drop it, as we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we will provide the umbrella. And that will...
And to chip this in, did you know that United States dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not because they couldn't go into Japan and defeat them. They used the Japanese as an example, as an scapegoat to the world, to show the world that This is what will happen to you if you mess with the United States of America. So they just use the Japanese as an experiment to show the world that this is what will happen to any nation that attacks the United States of America.
Will enable you to use the money you might otherwise have used for defense to really compete with the communists, provide jobs, provide housing, do the social welfare that you referred to, create the laws pushed often by the socialists. They simply took the socialist program, the communist program, and they instituted it and they paid for it and they had the money because they didn't have a defense establishment, didn't need it. The U.S. provided it. But of course, what the U.S. provided was wonderful for the U.S. Why? Because we took all the borrowed money and pumped it into the military-industrial complex. To provide an umbrella, never left a dollar, didn't leave the country, didn't need to. It stayed right here, stimulating the production of bombs and ships and all the rest of it. So you got your Keynesian stimulus at home from military spending, and you had a war on the working class in Europe carried out by your flunkies, the people who built their political career on being slavishly grateful to the United States for protecting them against the evil Russian communists, all of this theater, and underneath it, a social welfare program.
So if I understand what he's saying, then the Russians are not evil as the West wants us to think they are. They have created the notion that the Russians are evil, and everybody, I would say virtually everybody in the West has bought into it. And it's like they have believed the lie so much that they are now living the lie out. Yes.
What's happening now is the disintegration of that deal. Can't do it anymore. The United States empire is shrinking. It doesn't have the resources. The last few wars it fought, it lost. It doesn't have the money. It can't borrow. The walls are closing in. And so suddenly the Europeans are told dishonestly, now do your fair share, as if they didn't. They had been token flunkies. I want to remind folks, the war in Vietnam that we lost, there were European army factions that came and fought with the United States. They weren't significant, they were marginal, but they were there doing their secondary slavish behavior. So were they in Bosnia, so were they in Iraq, so are they now in Ukraine, and all the screeching that you hear about, how terrible of Mr. Trump to withdraw. That's the screeching of the politicians whose entire careers were the Cold War subordination of Europe to the United States. They will one day be reviled by the people of Europe because of the role that they've played, and they're now going to their end, screeching louder than ever with the nonsense, total nonsense, that Europe and America couldn't win in Ukraine, and now the Europeans are going to do it all by themselves.
I will end the video here. But you see, the lie the Europeans and the Americans propagated onto the Russians, that they are bloodthirsty animals, they will invade Poland after Ukraine, they will invade, all those countries they share a border with. Those things are all lies, all right? But Europe had decided to go, Europe has decided to, militarize their economies again. And I would say this will come back to hurt them. This will come back to hurt them massively in the way that I predict that if Europe, especially Germany, goes on with this militarization of the economy, they will get a lot of protests, demonstrations from their own people because they don't even have the money to do what they are promising. The only way they can get this money is by cutting out or cutting down on social amenities like good healthcare, social welfares. They have a lot of infrastructure that the government supports that, lightens the burdens of the citizens. Now, if they want to go into the full militarization of the economy, that means they have to do away with some of those things. And believe me, there are people who will not agree. And this will go, this will actually affect their economies. I don't really see how these people think the world works. Anything they do backfires. Anything they do against these Russians comes back to hurt them. But they hate the Russians so much that they just can't let go. They just can't let go. And this is very bad. This is really bad.